The journey goes west, and these pins are the best. Sun Wukong and Tripitaka are available as enamel pins, not in 100 chapters at Thunderclap Monastery, but right now in our merch shop. Achieve pin enlightenment for a limited time, link below. Where did Rome get it from? The grandest and by far most famous civilization to spring from the Italian peninsula does not simply arrive fully formed. Rome, as it so happens, was not built in a day. Whoa, oh my god, look guys, he said the thing. But was the product of centuries spent growing and learning from a variety of sources. Art modeled after the Greeks, seafaring hastily copied from the Carthaginians, monumental architecture inspired by the Egyptians, deities borrowed from every pantheon they got their hands on. The Romans are a product of their Mediterranean environment. Quite simply, they got it from everywhere. But nowhere in all of Rome's long and winding history was as consequential as the first place they got it from, a mysterious and far lesser known civilization called the Etruscans. Just up the peninsula from our boys in red, the area we now know as the rolling green hills of Tuscany was once home to dense woodlands and an interconnected network of cities with political systems, religion, and traditions that would become fundamental to the Roman identity. Rome's alphabet, gladiatorial games, divination practices, symbols of power, even the toga were all direct legacies of Rome's first mentor civilization. But as much credit as this framing rightly gives the Etruscans, it also reduces them to a side character in Rome's story, a season 1 antagonist to get the plot moving, that placed with the culture we liked and the kings we hated, a civilization to learn from and then conquer once we outgrew them. Unfortunately, history makes it very hard for us to understand the Etruscans on their own terms, as we're left with precious few written sources and no proper histories in their own words. Instead, we hear exclusively from their rivals, the Greek and Roman authors who make no attempts to hide their biases. As important as the Etruscans were in their heyday, stretching from the Po River Valley in the northeast down to the Bay of Naples in the south, their long afterlife has been all but silent. So, that's a tricky history to summarize. Are we stuck? I think not, and for a few reasons. As murky as it is under Rome's shadow, we can shine a light from two angles. One is good old-fashioned archaeology, the cities, tombs, inscriptions, and countless artworks the Etruscans left behind, and the second is through their interactions with the Greek world. The Hellenic gang saw the Etruscans as a rival, but whereas Rome demonized the Etruscans as a foundational nemesis in their highly mythologized origin story, the Greeks considered the Etruscans as a peer civilization, and we can observe some interesting parallels in how their stories play out. Take all that together, and I'd argue that, even in the absence of an Etruscan history in their own words, we can supplement pure archaeology with the perspective of their neighbors, and better understand the Etruscans as a civilization by triangulating them with Greece, their peer and rival, and Rome, their student and conqueror. So, let's do precisely that, and also some history. The first stop on our journey of understanding is the linguistics department, because the Etruscans, as is so often the case, did not call themselves that. Their inscriptions use the word rasna, meaning the people, but rather it's from their Latin-speaking neighbors in Rome that we get the words Etrusci and Tusci, as well as their homeland of Etruria, which appears in modern Italian as Toscana or our English Tuscany. That particular etymology likely came through the nearby Umbrian language, but the precise links are harder to detangle. We're also at a bit of a loss for the last major name for them, Tirsini, from our pals the Greeks. The Greek word rasenna is just the OG rasna in a different font, but the more frequently used Tirsini and its later form Tirini, or Tyrrhenian in English, have no obvious corollary. What gives? Their first attestation is in Hesiod's Theogony from circa 700 BC, describing them simply as the famous Tyrrhenians living alongside the Latins far away across the sea. And not just any old sea, but the Tyrrhenian Sea, named by the Greeks for them in particular rather than the Latinate Romans or even the Italian peninsula overall. This naming choice tells us that just as the Greeks named the Aegean Sea for one of their own guys, they considered the waters west of Italy as Tyrrhenian territory. And get this, across the Italian peninsula, the Greek name for the Adriatic Sea, Oadrias, comes from the Etruscan settlement of Adria on the northeast coast of Italy. Taken together, all these names reveal a tremendous amount about not just who the Etruscans were, but how their neighbors viewed them. And in the case of the Greeks, they begrudgingly respected the Etruscans enough to confer double dominion over Italy's seas. Of course, professional respect is no obstruction to competition, as the Greeks and Etruscans alike had their sights on the rich agricultural land and natural harbors along the Bay of Naples. In the vicinity of 800 BC, Greek colonists founded a trading post at Pithekousse, while Etruscans made a settlement at Capua. Capeva in Etruscan. For the next 500 years, the northern edge of Magna Graecia blended with the southern reach of Etruria Campana, as Greeks and Etruscans fought for dominance over the most desirable nexus of resources and trade on the Italian peninsula. But what exactly did they trade? According to Etruscan burials from the late 600s BC, a lot. The so-called Isis tomb from Velk was filled with bronze statues, vessels, and tools, gold jewelry with animal motifs and alabaster bottles sculpted to look like women, ivory carvings and ostrich eggs, goblets of faience, and tons of other artifacts with distinct origins in the Eastern Med, Anatolia, the Levant, and especially Egypt. Now, very few Etruscans could afford this kind of display. Throwing that much wealth into the ground is some real aristocrat BS, but it points to how comfortable the Etruscans as a society were at acquiring goods from distant and different places. They needed robust maritime networks as well as something their friends out east wanted to buy. Evidence for what that something is way less than we'd like. Well, we know by geography that the Etruscans had plentiful timber above ground, plus copper for bronze making and other useful metals below. We don't see a lot of Etruscan stuff outside Etruria. A handful of their Bucero-style pottery at various Greek and Phoenician ports, but nowhere near enough to balance out. So, were their exports all raw materials that took final shape elsewhere? Did they trade in perishable or recyclable materials? Bronze, for instance, is very easy to melt and recast, so bye-bye evidence. Or did they make their wealth some other way that resists appearing in the archaeological record? We know from their imports that they clearly did have the money. Egyptian goods in the 600s, Athenian pottery in the 400s, we just don't know how. And unfortunately, this is the case with a lot when it comes to the Etruscans. Ancient mysteriousness 1, historical clarity 0, and pain infinity. Now, one thing we can clearly trace is when and how the Etruscans got their writing, as it follows the same pathways as commerce. We saw that Greeks from the island of Evia settled in the Bay of Naples around 800, and by 700 BC, the Etruscans are writing with a variant of Greek, namely the same modified characters and right-to-left directionality as the Evian alphabet, one of a dozen regional scripts before Greek got standardized in the Hellenistic era. So scarcely a century after the Greeks picked up writing from their merchant buddies the Phoenicians, that same process of linguistic transfer on the back of trade happened again for the Etruscans. And it was all worth it for my second favorite piece of Etruscan art, this 7th century Bucero vessel of a rooster with the full front-to-back alphabet inscribed. Behold him, for he is perfect, and I dare say no writer's desk is complete without Cockerel Vessel 650-600 BC Etruscan Bucero. I love him. And of course, the linguistic transfer continued as Etruscan writing inspired most of the scripts across Italy, south to Umbrian and Oscan, north to Venetic and Rhaetic languages in the Povalian Alps, and next door to the early Latin script of Rome. We know that language follows commerce, so we can in turn conclude that the Etruscans had trading links all up and down the peninsula. Now hang on a minute, I mentioned Etruscan writing was lost, but here I am talking about their alphabet and language. So which is it? Great question, me, you tee up my transition so well. What we have are inscriptions, carvings in stone, ceramic, and bronze, which are insightful but usually pretty short. What we're missing is the long-form stuff that we know they wrote because Roman authors describe Etruscan books on divination and funerary practice, but those sources didn't survive. That's for two reasons. First is that the Etruscans wrote their books on linen and papyrus, great and plentiful materials, except that they degrade very quickly. That is, unless you happen to be this Egyptian mummy who was wrapped with linen from a book on the Etruscan religious calendar. And these 1,200 words are the longest string of Etruscan we have. Not a lot. The second and much bigger problem for preservation is that once Rome's mother tongue of Latin became the first language of Italy, Etruscan faded from public use, and by the imperial era, it was the niche tongue of Etruscan priests. This is the wombo combo of lost language, wherein the written sources degrade physically and are never replenished because the language has eroded culturally. The text goes bye-bye and there's no interest in making copies. Our paltry library grows even smaller because there's a lot of Etruscan we straight up can't read. But like the Rosetta Stone, sometimes history throws us a lifeline, and we're lucky enough to have these gold tablets from Pyrgi written in Etruscan and Phoenician commemorating the dedication of a temple by a local ruler, called a zealoth. Side note, this also implies widespread literacy. Very cool. Wish we had any more sources. Alas, archaeology can only dig so fast. But dig they do, and they found a ton of stuff across Etruria, enough that we can define 4 distinct eras of Etruscan history by the evolution in their material culture. Frustratingly, literally every source I read used different dates for when each period starts and ends, and frankly, I personally don't like the names for these eras either, but hard categorizations are always a losing battle, so whatever, it's fine, let's just run through the list. First is the Villanovan period, named for the village near Bologna where a giant necropolis from that era was first unearthed. This proto-Etruscan phase from the 900s through the 700s had a robust tradition of bronze making and a preference for cremation, where the dead were housed in urns of a double cone shape, or, in some cases, a literal miniature house. Morbid, yes, but honestly quite touching. As we get towards 700 BC, the engine of Mediterranean trade had fully gotten going. Etruscans are sailing out while the rest of the sea is also coming to them, and those influences, especially from the east, start to affect Etruscan culture. One avenue is writing, another is the shift from cremation to burials and elaborate tombs, and third is black figure vase painting from Greece. At the same time, the Etruscans developed a unique style of pottery called bucero, with a glossy black finish that gives the pieces a metallic quality, that deep color almost like an oiled bronze. Cockerel vessels 650 to 600 BC Etruscan bucero, my beloved. This era, from the mid-700s to late 6s, is termed, somewhat suspiciously, as the Orientalizing period for its eastward sources of inspiration. Which, yes, is what happened, but defining anything in terms of something foreign is kind of bad practice, and historians try not to do that anymore. So, in context, I can't really be mad that the next 2 periods lift their names directly from the corresponding Greek Archaic and Classical eras. Unimaginative, but I'll take it. The Etruscan Archaic, from the late 600s through the mid-400s, is best known for a spectacular boom in Etruscan tombs. This is where we find the Isis tomb from earlier with its vast array of overseas goods, along with burial chambers like the magnificently painted Tomb of the Leopards. The Etruscans are truly such good artists in every medium they touch, it's actually insane. See, for instance, the sarcophagus of the spouses from the late 500s, a terracotta sculpture of husband and wife reclining on a dining couch for their eternal rest. The level of detail is astounding. This also points to a unique feature of Etruscan society in comparison to the Greeks and Romans, the social status of their women. This gets the full toxic gossip train in the ancient sources because misogyny was a competition and the Greeks played to win, but reading between the vitriol about these women's craven ambition or depraved licentiousness, we get a sense of Etruscan women as independent and present in social life. They were allowed at dinner parties. A scandal. It's impossible to get a true read on it because Etruscan art shows but cannot explain, while external Greek and Roman sources accuse but cannot prove. Well, that's history for you. And that brings us to the Etruscan Classical period from the late 400s to the mid-200s. This is an era of supreme contrast, the most ornate and elaborate their art had ever been, and the absolute most dire it ever looked for their teetering civilization. Starting in the 400s, the Greeks of Magna Graecia and ascendant Carthaginian Empire clawed away at Etruscan power, opening the door for Rome to emerge out from centuries of Etruscan dominance to fully conquer Italy in the 300s and 200s. These anxieties, or more aptly existential hazards, made their way into Etruscan art, as the Tomb of the Infernal Chariot from the late 300s shows mortals assailed by death demons driving pale white horses with claws of lions, and also a straight-up Hydra. Yikes! On the flip side, this era made my #1 favorite sculpture in not just Etruscan history, but in all of ancient bronze work, the Chimera of Arezzo. It's the surviving half of a battle scene with the hero Bellerophon, which would have been immaculately sick to see in its entirety, but even on its own, the Chimera is a masterpiece. The animal heads, the different manes, the musculature, the posing, the wounds from Bellerophon's spear, the statue rules! But speaking of ruling, by 264 BC, the Etruscans had all been conquered, with the Roman Republic firmly in charge of the civilization that taught them so much. Which is why I honestly vote for a 5th period in the Etruscan timeline, the Age of the Romans, or in Latin, Romanorum. This final era completes the timeline, as Etruscan culture goes from a distinct entity within the Roman state to becoming fully subsumed under Roman culture by the end of the millennium. These centuries saw multiple failed rebellions alongside the slow erasure of Etruscan language from public life. However, the art remained, bringing us a proud bronze statue of the Orator depicting the Etruscan senator Aulus Metellus in around 100 BC. Meanwhile, the so-called Piacenza liver from around the same time is a bronze sculpted model of a sheep's liver used for divination. Romans relied heavily on the augury of Etruscan priests, and it remains the most prominent element of Etruria's culture long into the imperial era, when all other traces of Etruscan identity had been crushed or co-opted by their Roman overlords. There is, of course, so much more to say about their deities, mortuary practices, and divination rituals, but I want to bring their story home by seeing what we can glean from their statecraft. In the absence of an Etruscan Thucydides, it's hard to pin down specifics, but the Etruscans were a people of cities. Like the polis system in Greece, Etruscan society clustered around autonomous urban settlements, usually on a high hilltop with surrounding walls. In the Orientalizing period, Etrurian villages were ruled by local kings called a laukme, but as maritime trade expanded in the Archaic era, the growing class of wealthy merchants seems to have precipitated an expansion of power away from the kings and aristocrats. Like in Greece, this could result in ambitious citizens seizing power for themselves and serving as chief magistrate or zealoth for far longer than the typical one-year term. But as power changed locally through the 500s, it also evolved at the civilizational level, as the 12 leading cities in Etruria banded together in a league. 2 smaller leagues also popped up in Campania and Padania. The goal was to maintain each city's autonomy, resolve disputes, and coordinate on diplomacy and warfare. Or at least attempt to. It is, admittedly, a little hard to trace these evolutions when sources are so spotty, but fortunately there's an elegant way to understand how the Etruscans conceived of civic power, a symbol they invented in the 620s and Rome later adopted, called the fasces. It's an axe head representing the power of the state held within a bundle of sticks representing the citizens at large. One stick can snap, but the whole bundle won't, and together they can swing an axe at you. Now surely nobody would ever frame this concept of strength through unity as a method of brutalizing and oppressing other people just as people-y as they are in the, say, 1920s and 30s especially, and god damn it! Idiota Mussolini, che cazzo hai fatto con I fasci? Porco diavolo, dai, pensavi con la tua mente oppure il cazzolino? Mangia merda e morte capovolto fuori dall'esso, come meriti, schifoso coglione. Dio mio. Allora, where were we? So, as I was saying, even without good descriptions of their governance, we can see their concept of power fitting right beside Greek civics and was likely the underlying mindset for the Roman Republic. This stands at odds with Rome's origin story of yeeting the stupid, awful Etruscan kings who oppressed them so badly, but it sure seems to me like Rome's emergence as a republic was part of a broader social movement across Etruria, Magna Graecia, and Greece. And as we come to the Etruscan classical era in the 400s and 300s, we reach the divergence point. Because while this vast realignment of civic power was a boon to cities like Athens and Rome, it seems to have had the opposite effect on the Etruscans, making them weaker against a backdrop of far bigger and stronger rivals. Just as the Greek cities were powerless against the snowballing might of Athens, Sparta, and Thebes, who in turn folded immediately under Macedonia, the Etruscan cities just could not organize themselves to survive in a more dangerous world. The first fateful domino was the Battle of Cumae in 474, where the Etruscan navy was defeated by Syracuse, disrupting their control of the Tyrrhenian Sea, offsetting trade routes, and opening up space for small upstart cities, like a certain SPQR, to claw out autonomy from Etruscan dominion. Etruria hoped to reassert themselves in 414 when they joined the Athenian expedition to Sicily against Syracuse, but that went even worse. In the 390s, Rome tried its luck besieging the Etruscan city of Veii, and despite the league being theoretically suited for just this task, they fully could not muster a response to this particular siege, nor the lasting and growing threat of Rome's ascent. Despite the boys in red having an overwhelming numerical disadvantage, they spent the 300s picking off cities across Italy one by one. By 264, they destroyed the league sanctuary at Orvieto, and the Etruscans were vanquished. GG, pack it up, start learning Latin. So, at the end of our tale, I'm left wondering how on earth did it end so poorly for the Etruscans? Well, I'd argue it was a change in circumstance they were catastrophically unequipped for. The strength of Etruscan society in the Orientalizing and Archaic periods was in its dispersion and local autonomy, allowing them to move fast, sail far, and wield their seafaring and mercantile powers to become dominant across Italy. This was perfect for the 8 to 500s when competition focused on resources and trade, but it completely completely fell apart in the 400s and 300s when their enemies got deeper, more centralized institutions which could in turn train up far stronger armies. The game had changed from one of soft power into outright conquest, and the traits which suited the Etruscans so well before now left them hopelessly outmatched. The sauce, which once was strong, was rendered weak by a changing world. Nobody in the Etruscan orbit was able to make that jump, except, and this is the spice zone, so brace yourself, Rome. Latin speakers they may be, every other tenet of their identity speaks to a deep history in Etruscan culture and civics going back centuries before their big solo act. Rome made the jump from kings to republic like the rest of Etruria, but succeeded in backing it up with the deep institutions necessary to thrive in a more dangerous era. That's Rome's divergence point, and that's why their name eclipses the entire civilization they sprang directly out of. And that takes me back to the idea of triangulating the Etruscans between Rome and Greece, because just as looking at their peers, rivals, descendants, and conquerors fills out the Etruscan story, the Tuscan gang in turn becomes a perfect lens through which to understand the entire Mediterranean ecosystem they were so integral to. They make us work for it. We have to look across the whole sea to really make the Etruscans make sense. But when we do that, the Etruscans become the essential center point of the classical world, lateral to Greece and vertical to Rome. If we get metaphorical with it for a moment, that's why their greatest artwork is also the most apt symbol for Etruscan civilization. They are, well and truly, a chimera. Every angle we take sees a separate head, but it's all part of the same creature, a different facet of the same thrashing beast. In spending so much effort triangulating the Etruscans, we've been figuratively studying all three heads to better understand the whole chimera binding them. Yet, as influential as they were, the Etruscans were doubly vanquished, defeated by Rome and demonized by sources whose voices outlast their own. And mysterious as that silence makes them, they remain one of the most fascinating characters in the Mediterranean story, whose artistic achievements stand among the masterpieces of classical art. I am of course referring to Cockerel Vessel 650 to 600 BC Etruscan Bucero baby! That's my boy right there! That is peak! Thank you for watching! I had a tangent about the internet's beloved boar vessel meme and how it was j'accused as a forgery as recently as 2021, but I, kinda got carried away with the rest of the script, huh? All's well, though, one less artifact in the way of the one true Etruscan ceramic. See you in the next video.